My grandfather was the kind of man who fixed things with whatever he had on hand: baling wire, hockey tape, a coffee tin full of mismatched screws he'd been collecting since 1974. The kind of man who wore the same canvas jacket for 30 years and called it perfectly broken in. The kind of man nobody in our family thought had $2 to rub together. Which is why, when his lawyer called me on a Tuesday afternoon in March and said the words sole beneficiary and property in the Muskokas, I assumed there had been a mistake. I was 26, working a shift supervisor job at a logistics warehouse outside of Barrie, Ontario. I lived in a basement apartment that smelled like the previous tenant's cigarettes, no matter how many times I cleaned it. I drove a 2009 Civic with a cracked dashboard and a heater that worked about 60% of the time. I was not a person who received phone calls about inherited property, but the lawyer, a quiet man named Mr. Feld, who spoke in the careful, measured way of someone who had delivered too much news to too many people, confirmed it twice. My grandfather, Franklin Ossie, had left me his cabin. Just me. Not my mother, not my uncle, not my cousin Brent, who had always been the one people in the family pointed to when they talked about potential. Just me. I hadn't even known my grandfather owned a cabin. My family had always talked about my grandfather the way people talk about a piece of furniture they can't get rid of, but don't quite know what to do with. He was there. He had always been there, but he existed at the edges of things, sitting at the far end of the table at Christmas, nursing the same cup of tea for 2 hours, watching everyone else with those quiet, dark eyes that never seemed to miss anything, but never seemed to say anything either. My mother called him difficult. My uncle called him closed off. My cousin Brent called him the old man, with the particular dismissiveness of someone who had never once sat down and actually talked to him. I used to sit with him. I don't even fully know why. Maybe because I was quiet too, and quiet people recognize each other. We'd sit on the back porch of my grandmother's house. My grandmother had passed when I was 11, and after that he kept the house in Sudbury for another 8 years before moving into a small apartment, and he would tell me things. Not big things, small things, the way ice forms on Lake Huron in January, the particular sound a black bear makes moving through brush, the name of a tool I'd never heard of and exactly what it was for. He died in February, a stroke. He was 81 years old and he had been, as far as any of us knew, completely alone. The reading of the will had been a quiet disaster. My mother sat rigid in her chair with the expression she uses when she is furious, but has decided not to make a scene yet. My uncle left the lawyer's office before Mr. Feld had finished speaking. Brent sent me a text that night that said, simply, "Must be nice." I drove up to the cabin alone on a Saturday in late March, following directions Mr. Feld had written out by hand on a sheet of yellow legal paper because the GPS on my phone kept losing signal once I got past a certain point on the highway north of Huntsville. The road narrowed, the trees thickened. The snow was still heavy up here, heavy and blue-shadowed in a way that felt nothing like the gray slush I'd left behind in Barrie. I passed a frozen lake that had no sign, no name I could find. I passed a turnoff with a reflector post, but no road name. I turned where the handwritten directions told me to turn, and 20 minutes later, through the trees, I saw it. It was not what I expected. I don't know exactly what I'd been picturing. Some small hunter's shack, maybe, the kind of thing you'd see collapsing in a field beside a gravel road. But this was a real structure. Old, yes. The cedar siding had gone silver, and the roof had a particular heavy sag in the northwest corner that made me nervous. But it was substantial. It had a covered porch running the full length of the front, a stone chimney, a woodshed attached to the side that was nearly as large as the cabin itself, still stocked with split birch. I stood in the snow for a long time before I went inside. The interior smelled like him, that specific combination of wood smoke, machine oil, and something I could only identify as old paper. There was a wood stove in the main room, with a box of matches sitting on top of it. A kitchen with a hand pump and a propane range. A narrow bed in the back room, with a Hudson's Bay blanket folded at the foot of it. His canvas jacket was hanging on a hook by the door. I sat at his kitchen table for about 20 minutes and did not move. Then I started opening drawers. I wasn't looking for anything specific. I think I was just looking for him, for some version of him that I hadn't been able to access while he was alive. I found what you'd expect: a flashlight, spare batteries, a stack of Ontario topographic maps, a tin of tobacco he'd clearly stopped using years ago, judging by how dry it was. A small leather notebook filled with handwriting so cramped I couldn't read most of it. A drawer in the bedroom dresser that was locked with a small padlock. I left the padlock alone. What I couldn't leave alone was the floor. I noticed it when I was walking from the kitchen to the back room. A faint, hollow quality to the sound under my boots, right in the center of the main room, where the floorboards were a slightly different age and color than the ones around them. I stopped. I crouched down. I pressed on the wood with both hands. It was not the same. It wasn't soft, wasn't rotting. It was hollow, and when I ran my fingers along the edge of the boards, 4 of them, arranged in a rough square about a meter across, I found a gap, just enough to get a grip. I went out to the woodshed and came back with a pry bar. It took me 20 minutes and some effort I hadn't expected. But eventually, with a sound like something exhaling after holding its breath for a very long time, the section of floor came up. Underneath was a set of wooden stairs, hand-built, leading down into cold dark. I stood there looking at them for a long time. I'm not going to pretend I wasn't frightened. It was March. I was alone on a property I had no idea existed until 10 days ago, and my grandfather had built a hidden room under his cabin in the middle of the Ontario wilderness. I went back to my truck and got my flashlight, the big one I keep in the back for road emergencies, and I went down the stairs. The room was about 4 meters by 3. The walls were poured concrete, the floor packed dirt with wooden pallets laid over it to keep things off the ground. There was a shelf unit along one wall, the metal kind you buy at a hardware store, and it was full. Boxes, some plastic sealed, some just cardboard. A filing cabinet, gray, with the kind of latch you have to squeeze to open. And on the shelf closest to the stairs, sitting by itself on an otherwise empty shelf like it was waiting to be seen, a wooden box, about the size of a shoebox, with a small envelope taped to the lid. The envelope had my name on it, in his handwriting. My hands were shaking by the time I got back up the stairs and into the light. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten, in the careful but imperfect cursive of a man who had learned penmanship in a different era. I read it twice standing at the kitchen table, then I sat down and read it a 3rd time. My grandfather had not always been a man who fixed things with baling wire and hockey tape. He had come to Canada from Ghana in 1968, when he was 23 years old, on a student visa to study engineering at the University of Waterloo. He had been, by his own description, ambitious in the way that young men from difficult circumstances tend to be ambitious. Not arrogantly, but desperately, with the specific hunger of someone who understands that failure is not an abstract concept. He graduated. He found work. He built a life in Sudbury, married my grandmother, had children. He also, for 18 years starting in 1971, worked as an informal financial courier for a network of men who moved money across the Ontario-Quebec border. He was very careful about how he described this in the letter. He never used certain words, but the meaning was clear enough. The network was not legitimate. It had connections to organized crime. Not the dramatic movie kind, but the mundane, deeply Canadian kind, the kind that exists inside legitimate industries, that hides in construction contracts and property development and waste management. He had not known the full extent of it when he started. By the time he understood what he was part of, he was too deep to simply leave. So he had done the next best thing. He had kept records. For 18 years, he had documented everything he could. Dates, amounts, names, locations, transaction methods. He had kept those records in the locked filing cabinet in the concrete room under his cabin in the Muskokas. Updated them as recently as 6 months before he died. And he had waited. Waited for what? I asked myself. And then I read the last page of the letter. He had waited for the right person to find them. I thought about destroying all of this many times, he wrote. I thought about taking it to the police myself. I was afraid. I want you to understand that plainly. I was afraid for a long time. These men are not all in the past. Some of them are still operating. Some of them are in positions where they could make serious trouble for a person they perceived as a threat. But I am 80 years old now, and I have made my peace. What I have not made my peace with is the idea of leaving this world without giving someone the chance to use what I have spent a very long time gathering. I am giving it to you because you are the one who listened. That is not a small thing. I hope you understand that. I folded the letter. I sat in the cabin with the gray March light coming through the window and the fire I'd started in the wood stove, crackling steadily, and I thought about what it would mean to just walk away. Leave the file cabinet locked. Board up the floor. Let whatever was in those boxes stay buried under the Ontario wilderness the way my grandfather had let it stay buried for decades. I thought about it seriously. I want to be honest about that. Then I went back downstairs and opened the filing cabinet. The files were organized by year. 18 years of records, each one in a labeled hanging folder, each folder containing handwritten logs and, in many cases, photocopies of documents my grandfather had managed to access and copy without being detected. Receipts, transaction records, a list of names that ran to 4 typed pages, single-spaced, some of them familiar to me in the vague way that names become familiar when you grow up in northern Ontario, people who appear in local news, on the boards of charitable organizations, whose names are on the backs of arena seats. I photographed everything with my phone. It took 3.5 hours. I was halfway through the 3rd filing drawer when my phone, which I had propped on the shelf for light, vibrated with a call. Unknown number. I stared at it. I let it go to voicemail. 30 seconds later, it rang again. I don't know what made me answer. I almost didn't. I know you're at the property. The voice was a man's, older, calm in a way that wasn't quite natural. I want you to understand that I have no interest in harming you. I only want the cabinet. Leave it on the porch and drive back to Barrie. No one needs to know you were ever there. My brain did several things simultaneously. It registered that this man knew where I lived. It registered that he knew about the cabinet. It registered that he was, apparently, watching the property somehow because he knew I was there. It also registered that if he simply wanted the cabinet gone, the simplest solution would have been to come up here after my grandfather died and take it himself, which meant he hadn't known about it until recently, which meant someone had told him. I thought about the phone call my mother had made to Mr. Feld's office, the one I'd overheard at the end of the will reading, where she'd asked what exactly was in the cabin. I need to think about it, I said. That's a reasonable response, the man said. You have until dark. He hung up. I stood in the concrete room for a moment, with my heart going at a pace it had no business going at. Then I finished photographing the last drawer, put everything back exactly as I had found it, and went upstairs. I looked out the front window and saw, at the end of the long drive, partially obscured by a stand of birch trees, the dark shape of a vehicle I hadn't noticed when I arrived. There was only one road in. I went out the back. The cabin backed onto Crown land. I found that in the property documents Mr. Feld had given me, and it was the only piece of information I'd tucked away without really knowing why. There was a path behind the woodshed, half buried in snow but still visible, the kind of path that gets made over many years of walking the same route. I followed it. The trees closed over me almost immediately. It was cold. I was wearing my work boots, not anything waterproof. The snow was thigh-deep in places where it had drifted against the cedars. I kept moving. My grandfather had walked this path. I kept thinking about that. He had walked this same path, in these same trees, probably many times. For what? Checking the back boundary. Or just walking, the way he used to walk, slowly, quietly, not going anywhere in particular, just being in the place he'd chosen for himself. 40 minutes later, I came out onto a secondary road I didn't recognize. I had cell signal. I called a friend from Barrie, Kenji, who is large and calm and has the particular quality of never asking questions until you've finished explaining things, and told him where I was. While I waited for him, I called 911, and then, on the advice of the dispatcher, I called the OPP's organized crime unit and left a message on a general line. I wasn't sure what would happen. I wasn't sure if any of this would amount to anything. Kenji arrived in 40 minutes. We drove back to Barrie and I sent the photographs, 273 of them, to an email address Kenji helped me set up on a new account, from his phone, just in case. 3 weeks later, I got a call from a detective with the Ontario Provincial Police, who had a number of careful questions about how exactly I had come to be in possession of certain financial records. I answered every one of them. It took 4 hours spread across 2 conversations. At the end of the second conversation, the detective told me, in the measured tone of someone not authorized to say much, that the records were potentially significant and that there would be further contact. There was. There was considerably more contact over the following 8 months, most of it involving lawyers, mine. Eventually, once the detectives suggested I get one, and eventually, quietly, without any of the dramatic press conferences I had half imagined, several investigations were opened. I was told I would be contacted if and when charges were laid. I was told my cooperation was noted. I was also told, by my own lawyer, that I should probably not stay at the cabin alone for a while. I didn't. I went back in September, when the maples had gone orange and the birch had gone yellow, and the Muskokas looked the way they look in the tourism photographs that are somehow never quite accurate enough. Kenji came with me. We spent a weekend clearing out the woodshed, fixing the sag in the roof with materials I found stacked in the woodshed, as though my grandfather had purchased them precisely for that repair and simply hadn't gotten to it yet. On the second evening, I found a photograph tucked into the pages of the leather notebook I'd found in the kitchen drawer. 2 men standing in front of a lake I recognized. The nameless frozen lake I'd passed on the way in, except in the photograph it was summer, green and sparkling. One of the men was my grandfather, maybe 40 years old, with an expression I had almost never seen on his face during his actual lifetime. Unguarded, happy. The other man I didn't recognize. I still don't know who he was. Maybe I'll find out. Maybe I won't. I kept the photograph on the shelf beside the wood stove, right where the wooden box with my name on it had been sitting. My mother has not spoken to me since the will reading. My uncle called once, in May, and the conversation lasted about 4 minutes before he said something I won't repeat and hung up. Brent stopped texting. I think they all expected me to sell the place, split whatever it was worth with the family, demonstrate that I understood how these things were supposed to go. The property was assessed at somewhere in the range of $400,000. I have no plans to sell it. My grandfather spent 18 years quietly doing the most careful and dangerous thing he had ever done. And he chose me to finish what he'd started. Not because I was the most capable person in our family, or the most successful, or the most anything. Because I was the one who sat with him. Because I listened. I think about that a lot. Alone up here on the weekends I can manage to come up, with the fire going and the snow starting again outside and the forest doing whatever forests do in the dark, that humans can't quite hear properly. He wasn't a ghost. He wasn't difficult, or closed off, or any of the other words people used for him. He was carrying something very heavy, for a very long time, and he was waiting until he found someone he trusted enough to hand it to. I hope I was worth the wait. Would you have gone down those stairs, or would you have walked away and never looked back?